Hello, welcome to Happy Story Time. If you guys enjoy, make sure like button, subscribe, and hit the bell on this video. Didn't twist my tongue that time. We are going to be reading a new book, but first we are going to start with the Bible. I don't know if we're doing a synopsis this series, but we're not doing one today because
it's the first chapter.
First episode. But we are going to be reading a brand new book. Hope you guys enjoy. That's coming up right now.
Hello. Oh gosh, my hair. Wow. Why didn't anybody tell me my hair? Okay, that was terrible. All right. Hello. How is everyone tonight? Thank you so much for joining us. So we are starting a new book, just as JJ said, and I hope that you enjoy it. All right. So, and we're also starting a new book of the Bible. And to accompany our new book, I tried to match the number of chapters with the number of chapters. We're going to be reading from the book of John. So, if you've never read John before, it's one of the greatest 4 Gospels that was ever written. And definitely one of my top 4 favorites. So, otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. This is the English Standard Version, and let me begin. The Gospel according to John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me.' For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." And this is the testimony of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" And he answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah had said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Then why are you baptizing if you are neither the Christ, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie." These things took place in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The next day he saw Jesus coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, 'After me comes a man who ranks before me, because he was before me.' I myself did not know him, but for this purpose I came baptizing with water, that he might be revealed to Israel." And John bore witness, "I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him. I myself did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, 'He on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain, this is he who baptizes with the Holy Spirit.' And I have seen and have borne witness that this is the Son of God." The next day, again, John was standing with two of his disciples, and he looked at Jesus as he walked by and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come, and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak and followed Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas," which means Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." And that's the end of chapter 1 from the Gospel of John. So, I know everybody's wondering what book we're going to read. So, here I am to tell you. It is right here on my bookshelf. We're going to lead off our Charles Dickens with Great Expectations. So, it's been a long time since I've read this, and I'm not sure I understood it the first time, but I think it's going to be it's going to be really good. I'm looking forward to it. We're going to read, with it, we're going to read the book of John, along with the letters of John. So, not the Revelation, but the letters of John. So, this is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Book 1, or Volume 1, is what it says in this edition. Just so you know, this was a serialized novel that was written in 18... It's going to tell me. I shouldn't have said it. It was written in the 1800s. It was first published in this book form. Oh, okay. Serialized was published in book form in 1861. So that's when this was written. And here we are. Let's go ahead and begin. Again, Great Expectations, Volume 1, Chapter 1. My father's family name being Pirip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I gave Pirip as my father's family name on the authority of his tombstone, and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. to 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside the grave, and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in the universal struggle. I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertained that they had all been born on their backs with their hands in their trousers pockets, and had never taken them out in this state of existence. Ours was the marsh country down by the river, within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon toward evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dikes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. "Hold your noise!" cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat!" A fearful man, all in coarse gray, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied round his head, a man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray, don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, staring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Pint out the place." I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore, among the alder trees and pollards, a mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips, "what fat cheeks have you got?" I think I turned 2 pages. I did. I believe they were fat, though I was at the time undersized for my years and not strong. "Darn me if I couldn't eat them," said the man with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to it. I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now looky here," said the man, "where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana. That's my mother." "Oh," said he, coming back. "And is that your father along her, your mother?" "Yes, sir," said I. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ha!" he muttered then, considering. "Who'd you live with, supposing you're kindly to live? Which I hadn't made up my mind about." "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery, wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and he looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now looky here," he said, "the question being whether you are to be let to live, you know what a file is." "Yes, sir." "And you know what wittles is." "Yes, sir." After each question he tilted me over a little more so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file," he tilted me again. "And you get me wittles," he tilted me again. "You bring 'em both to me," he tilted me again, "or I'll have your heart and liver out," he tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened, and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll, so that the church jumped over in its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms, in an upright position on the top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me, tomorrow morning early, that file and them wittles. You bring the lot to me, at that old battery over yonder. You do it, and you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted, and ate. Now I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret way, peculiar to himself, of getting at a boy, and at his heart, and at his liver. It is in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, and may warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am keeping that young man from harming of you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off of your inside. Now what do you say?" I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could find, and I would come to him at the battery early in the morning. "Say Lord strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home." Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much of that," said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog or an eel." At the same time he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself as if to hold himself together, and limped toward the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles and among the brambles that bound the green mounds, he took in my young eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people, stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it, like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then turned round to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face toward home, and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder, and saw him going on again toward the river, still hugging himself in both arms, and picking his way with sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there, for stepping places where the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long black horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other a gibbet with some chains hanging to it which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on toward this latter, as if he were the pirate come to life, and come down, and going back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all round for the horrible young man and could see no signs of him. But now I was frightened again and ran home without stopping. And once again, this book, the pages kind of stick together a bit, so it is what it is. Now we're on chapter 2. My sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, was more than 20 years older than I, and had established a great reputation with herself and the neighbors because she had brought me up by hand. Having at that time to find out for myself what the expression meant, and knowing her to have a hard and heavy hand, and to be much in the habit of laying it upon her husband as well as upon me, I suppose that Joe Gargery and I were both brought up by hand. She was not a good-looking woman, my sister, and I had a general impression that she must have made Joe Gargery marry her by hand. Joe was a fair man, with curls of flaxen hair on each side of his smooth face, and with eyes of such a very undecided blue that they seemed to have somehow got mixed with their own whites. He was a mild, good-natured, sweet-tempered, easy-going, foolish, dear fellow, a sort of Hercules in strength and also in weakness. My sister, Mrs. Joe, with black hair and eyes, had such a prevailing redness of skin that I sometimes used to wonder whether it was possible she washed herself with a nutmeg grater instead of soap. She was tall and bony, and almost always wore a coarse apron, fastened over her figure behind with 2 loops, and having a square impregnable bib in front, that was stuck full of pins and needles. She made it a powerful merit in herself, and a strong reproach against Joe, that she wore this apron so much, though I really see no reason why she should have worn it at all, or why, if she did wear it at all, she should not have taken it off every day of her life. Joe's forge adjoined our house, which was a wooden house, as many of the dwellings in our country were, most of them at that time. When I ran home from the churchyard, the forge was shut up, and Joe was sitting alone in the kitchen. Joe and I being fellow sufferers, and having confidences as such, Joe imparted a confidence to me the moment I raised the latch of the door and peeped in at him opposite to it, sitting in the chimney corner. Mrs. Joe has been out a dozen times looking for you, Pip, and she's out now making it a baker's dozen. Is she? Yes, Pip, said Joe, and what's worse, she's got Tickler with her. At this dismal intelligence I twisted the only button on my waistcoat round, and looked in great depression at the fire. Tickler was a wax-ended piece of cane, worn smooth by collision with my tickled frame. She sot down, said Joe, and she got up, and she made a grab at Tickler, and then she rampaged out. That's what she did, said Joe, slowly clearing the fire between the lower bars with the poker and looking at it. She rampaged out, Pip. Has she been gone long, Joe? I always treated him as a larger species of child, and as no more than my equal. Well, said Joe, glancing up at the Dutch clock, she's been on the rampage this last spell about 5 minutes, Pip. She's a-comin'. Get behind the door, old chap, and have a jack towel betwixt you. I took the advice, my sister, Mrs. Joe, throwing the door wide open, and finding an obstruction behind it, immediately divined the cause, and applied Tickler to its further investigation. She concluded by throwing me. I often served as a connubial missile at Joe, who, glad to get hold of me on any terms, passed me on into the chimney and quietly fenced me up there with his great leg. "Where have you been, you young monkey?" said Mrs. Joe, stamping her foot. "Tell me directly what you've been doing to wear me away with fret and fright and worrit, or I'll have you out of that corner if you was 50 pips, and he was 500 gargeries." "I have only been to the churchyard," said I, from my stool, crying and rubbing myself. "Churchyard!" repeated my sister. "If it weren't for me, you'd have been to the churchyard long ago, and stayed there. Who brought you up by hand?" "You did," said I. "And why did I do it, I should like to know?" exclaimed my sister. I whimpered. "I don't know." "I don't," said my sister. "I'd never do it again, I know that. I may truly say I've never had this apron of mine off since born you were. It's bad enough to be a blacksmith's wife, and him a gargery, without being your mother. My thoughts strayed from that question as I looked disconsolately at the fire. For the fugitive out on the marshes with the iron leg, the mysterious young man, the file, the food, and the dreadful pledge I was under to commit a larceny on those sheltering premises rose before me in the avenging coals. "Ha!" said Mrs. Joe, restoring Tickler to his station. "Churchyard, indeed! You may well say churchyard, you two. One of us, by the by, had not said it at all. You'll drive me to the churchyard betwixt you, one of these days, and oh, precious pair you'd be without me." As she applied herself to set the tea things, Joe peeped down at me over his leg, as if he were mentally casting me and himself up and calculating what kind of pair we practically should make, under the grievous circumstances foreshadowed. After that, he sat feeling his right side flaxen curls and whisker, and following Mrs. Joe about with his blue eyes, and his manner always was at squally times. My sister had a trenchant way of cutting our bread and butter for us that never varied. First, with her left hand, she jammed the loaf hard and fast against her bib, where it sometimes got a pin into it, and sometimes a needle, which we afterward got into our mouths. Then she took some butter, not too much, on a knife and spread it on the loaf in the apothecary kind of way, as if she were making a plaster, using both sides of the knife with a slapping dexterity, and trimming and molding the butter off round the crust. Then she gave the knife a final smart wipe on the edge of the plaster, and then sawed a very thick round off the loaf, which she finally, before separating from the loaf, hewed into two halves, of which Joe got one and I got the other. On the present occasion, though I was hungry, I dared not eat my slice. I felt that I must have something in reserve for my dreadful acquaintance, and his ally, the still more dreadful young man. I knew Mrs. Joe's housekeeping to be of the strictest kind, and that my larcenous researches might find nothing available in the safe. Therefore I resolved to put my hunk of bread and butter down the leg of my trousers. The effort of resolution necessary to the achievement of this purpose I found to be quite awful. It was as if I had to make up my mind to leap from the top of a high house or plunge into great depth of water, and it was made the more difficult by the unconscious Joe. In our already mentioned Freemasonry as fellow-sufferers, and in his good-natured companionship with me, it was our evening habit to compare the way we bit through our slices by silently holding them up to each other's admiration now and then, which stimulated us to new exertions. Tonight, Joe several times invited me, by the display of his fast-diminishing slice, to enter upon our usual friendly competition, but he found me each time with my yellow mug of tea on one knee, and my untouched bread and butter on the other. At last I desperately considered that the thing I contemplated must be done, and that it had best be done in the least improbable manner consistent with the circumstances. I took advantage of a moment when Joe had just looked at me, and got my bread and butter down my leg. Joe was evidently made uncomfortable by what he supposed to be my loss of appetite, and took a thoughtful bite out of his slice, which he didn't seem to enjoy. He turned it about in his mouth much longer than usual, pondering over it a good deal, and after all gulped it down like a pill. He was about to take another bite, and had just got his head on one side for a good purchase on it, when his eye fell on me, and he saw that my bread and butter was gone. The wonder and consternation with which Joe stopped on the threshold of his bite and stared at me were too evident to escape my sister's observation. "What's the matter now?" said she, smartly, as she put down her cup. "I say, you know," muttered Joe, shaking his head at me in very serious remonstrance. "Pip, old chap, you'll do yourself a mischief. It'll stick somewhere. You can't have chawed it, Pip. "What's the matter now?" repeated my sister more sharply than before. "If you can cough any trifle on it up, Pip, I'd recommend you do it," said Joe, all aghast. "Manners is manners, but still, your 'ealth is your 'ealth." By this time my sister was quite desperate, so she pounced on Joe, and taking him by the two whiskers, knocked his head for a little while against the wall behind him, while I sat in the corner looking guiltily on. "Now, perhaps you'll mention what's the matter," said my sister, out of breath. You staring great stuck pig." Joe looked at her in a helpless way, then took a helpless bite and looked at me again. "You know, Pip," said Joe solemnly, with his last bite in his cheek, and speaking in a confidential voice, as if we two were quite alone, "you and me is always friends, and I'd be the last to tell upon you any time, but such a—" He moved his chair and looked about the floor between us, and then again at me. "Such a most uncommon bolt as that?" "Been bolting his food, has he?" cried my sister. "You know, old chap," said Joe, looking at me and not at Mrs. Joe, with his bite still in his cheek, "I bolted myself when I was your age, frequent, and as a boy I've been among a many bolters, but I never see your bolting equal yet, Pip, and it's a mercy you ain't bolted dead." My sister made a dive at me, and fished me up by the hair, saying nothing more than the awful words, "You come along and be dosed." Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative, that I was conscious of going about, smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening, the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down my throat for my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm as a boot would be held in a boot-jack. Joe got off with half a pint, but was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance, as he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly had a turn afterward, if he had had none before. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, that secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe— I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his— united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on any small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I heard the voice outside of the man with the iron on his leg, who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must be fed now. At other times I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from embruising his hands in me should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight instead of tomorrow. If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then. But perhaps nobody ever did. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for the next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg, and found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable. Happily, I slipped away and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. "Hark," said I, when I had done my stirring, and was taken a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "Was that great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped! Escaped!" administering the definition like tar water. While Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework, I put my mouth into the forms of saying to Joe, "What's a convict?" Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a highly elaborate answer that I could make out nothing of it, but the single word pip. "There was a convict off last night," said Joe aloud, "after Sunset Gun, and they fired warning of him, and now it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. "Drat that boy," interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. "What a questioner he is! Ask no questions, and you'll be told no lies." It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her even if I did ask questions, but she never was polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide and to put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe and put my mouth into the form of saying, "Her?" But Joe wouldn't hear of that at all, and again opened his mouth very wide and shook the form of a most emphatic word out of it, but I could make nothing of the word. "Mrs. Joe," said I, as a last resort, "I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from." "Lord bless this boy!" exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. "From the hulks." "Oh," said I, looking at Joe. "Hulks." Joe gave a reproachful cough, as much to say, "Well, I told you so." "And please, what's hulks?" said I. "That's the way with this boy," exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread, and shaking her head at me. "Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right across the meshes. We always used that name for marshes in our country." "I wonder who's put in prison ships, and why they're put there," said I, in a general way, and with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. "I tell you what, young fellow," said she, "I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out. It would be blame to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the hulks because they murder, and because they rob, and forge, and do all sorts of bad, and they always begin by asking questions. Now you get along to bed." I was never allowed a candle to light me to bed, and as I went upstairs in the dark with my head tingling from Mrs. Joe's thimble having played the tambourine upon it to accompany her last words, I felt fearfully sensible of the great convenience that the hulks were handy for me. I was clearly on my way up there. I had begun by asking questions, and I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. Since that time, which is far enough away now, I have often thought that few people know what secrecy there is in the young under terror. No matter how unreasonable the terror, so that it be terror. I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver. I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the iron leg. I was in mortal terror of myself, from whom an awful promise had been extracted. I had no hope of deliverance through my all-powerful sister, who repulsed me at every turn. I am afraid to think of what I might have done on requirement in the secrecy of my terror. If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the hulks, a ghostly pirate calling out to me through a speaking trumpet as I passed the gibbet station, that I had better come ashore and be hanged there at once, and not put it off. I was afraid to sleep, even if I had been inclined, for I knew that at the first faint dawn of morning I must rob the pantry. There was no doing it in the night, for there was no getting a light by easy friction then. To have got one, I must have struck it out of flint and steel, and have made a noise like the very pirate himself rattling his chains. As soon as the great black velvet pall outside my little window was shot with gray, I got up and went downstairs, every board upon the way, and every crack in every board calling after me, "Stop, thief! And get up, Mrs. Joe!" In the pantry, which was far more abundantly supplied than usual, owing to the season, I was very much alarmed by a hare hanging up by the heels, whom I rather thought I caught when my back was half turned, winking. I had no time for verification, no time for selection, no time for anything, for I had no time to spare. I stole some bread, some rind of cheese, about half a jar of mincemeat, which I tied up in my pocket handkerchief with my last night's slice, some brandy from a stone bottle, which I decanted into a glass bottle I had secretly used for making that intoxicating liquid, Spanish licorice water up in my room, diluting the stone bottle from a jug in the kitchen cupboard, a meat bone with very little on it, and a beautiful round compact pork pie. I was nearly going away without the pie, but I was tempted to mount upon a shelf to look what it was that was put away so carefully in a covered earthenware dish in a corner, and I found it was the pie, and I took it in the hope that it was not intended for early use and would not be missed for some time. There was a door in the kitchen communicating with the forge. I unlocked and unbolted that door and got a file from among Joe's tools. Then I put the fastenings as I had found them, opened the door at which I had entered when I ran home last night, shut it, and ran for the misty marshes. And that's the end of chapter 2. That's where we'll stop for the day. Next chapter is chapter 3. The first word is it. And there's no titles to these chapters, so just chapter 3. Hope you're enjoying Great Expectations. It is exceeding my expectations so far, so I hope that you're enjoying it, and we'll continue it again next time. God bless you. Have a great night, and we'll see you then. Bye.